This is a short video that myself and my colleague Phil Brown from High Five will contribute to as a follow-up to the webinar that we participated in on May 11th. The panel of 9 that was exploring tips and activities for virtual facilitation. So we wanted to expand a little bit on our activities that we offered as a way of following up with folks. So Phil and I both looked at some of the themes that we noticed in the chat and decided that we would take the opportunity to elaborate. So the piece that I brought to that conversation was about breaking the script, boosting sensory appeal, and allowing for joyful observation. And with more time, there's a few things I would have expanded on. We were, of course, limited by necessity to a short window to get all those great voices in. One is the idea of where does your best idea come from? And when Mark Collard reached out to us asking us to participate, my first thought was, I don't have any expertise in virtual facilitation because it's really a new thing for me. And then I went to my second default, which is usually where do my ideas come from, and where is one of my best professional development sources? And one of the things that always helps spark my thinking is asking myself the question, well, what am I into right now? What are some books that I'm reading that are important? Or what are some concepts that are either in my work life or otherwise that seem to be resonating with me? And that's where the idea for sending something in the mail, creating something, allowing for that moment comes from. So I think that the expanded tip I would suggest is look at where your interests are right now and figure out if there's a way to bring those to life. Because if you're genuinely excited about something, that will come across in a professional context, as long as it's not, completely out there. So I happen to be kind of into crafts and sending things in the mail. And so there's a way to sort of bring that in. There's 2 books that I mentioned in my piece, and I want to add a third one. So the ones I already mentioned were The Power of Moments by the Heath brothers. They've written a series of books, all of which I have found easy to read and informative in my work as a facilitator. The other one is The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, and a piece too about, when I mentioned books, you don't have to read the whole book to get some of the concepts. A lot of these folks have websites or TED Talks or podcasts where you can really get a little bit of a flavor if sort of reading the whole book seems overwhelming. And then the third one is called Joyful by Ingrid Fattel-Lee. And she's got a great TED Talk that led me to then get her book. And she really breaks down sort of the science around how we can see something and how it can then create an emotional response. And I think that sort of creates that trifecta of sort of 3 concepts that I wanted to weave in terms of, for her book in particular, that joyful observation of how do we actually biologically, chemically experience a joyful reaction when we see certain things. She talks a lot about color and symmetry. That wasn't my purpose, but that's another resource I would share. Finally, the piece that I just want to elaborate on a little bit in terms of thinking about facilitating virtually is, how do you take what you've done in person and then what's the filter that you run it through to then decide this makes sense to do virtually? And I have found as a participant that I can show up much more present and ready to contribute if there's an agenda or a meeting or a purpose that can be somewhat disputable. And that's directly from Priya Parker's work. Create a meeting that has an agenda where the purpose is disputable. So for example, I might say, we used to meet every Friday at noon, so we're going to keep doing it. In a completely different environment where there's a pandemic or people are working at home unexpectedly or people are frontline workers, you might say, well, I don't agree. How do I know that purpose has changed? So it took me a while to get my head around this disputable concept, but it's just sort of adding a little bit of hot sauce to the agenda by having something that folks can either agree with or not agree with, having some kind of purpose. So even if folks are skeptical, they're still going to come to the meeting in some way to have their skepticism resolved. So I brought that concept unintentionally with my opening the box piece, because to me, it was going to be super important, but I wasn't totally positive that it was. And so I even came to the webinar wondering like, how's this going to go? So that curiosity, something that's disputable, will inherently provoke curiosity. And as a person who relies on adventure learning as a primary modality, that's super important. So thanks so much for tuning in to that hour. It was really fun to prepare for it and be a part of it and learn so much from my co-panelists. And Phil will add his piece around the Zoom mastermind, which was really, really fun to play. And we're excited to hear from you and hear what is working for you, what your questions are, and see how you've taken some of these concepts and made them real and authentic and important to your work settings. Take care.
Hey everyone, Phil here. This next video is going to be an extension on the Zoom Mastermind activity that I led in the webinar. But I forgot to mention one specific piece of information that's really important, so I'm throwing this in at the start, and it's that this frog was drawn by me. Okay, hey everyone, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more detail about the Zoom Mastermind. I'm going to address 3 topics that got brought up in the chat also. One of them was people bringing up variations, so I'm going to talk about some of that. The other was how to reflect on it. And then right at the end, someone asked actually in the Q&A how any other activities you could use the gallery view and initiatives. So I'm going to show one of those as well. So first on the variations. One variation that I was seeing in the chat was actually instead of doing the full 9 grid as I did it in the activity, if you just thought of the either the 4 around me, around my screen, or even giving people rows and saying you're in those rows, that might make that easier. So instead of giving 1 to 9, you can just give 1 to 4. Everyone has numbers 1 to 4, and they figure out where they are in the position closest to me. They're just the 4. And that way I could also give people information in terms of not only were grids correct, but if people were correct. So I would have maybe, let's say Nate, I had him in number 1. If he stepped into number 1, not only would a position be correct, but also the person would be correct. So the number and the person. So that gives a little bit more opportunity of variation, and it limits it, makes it more accessible. I think that in terms of how many people, you're probably going to max out about 12 people, and then otherwise it would get boring. So just consider that in terms of people's ability to be able to stay engaged in the activity. On to reflection, how I might reflect on this activity. What I tend to do with problem-solving activities anyway is to frame it with a group by going through the A, B, C, D, E's of problem-solving. So I'm going to do that with you all here. A is asking questions, so making sure people ask questions, so you know what you're doing. B is brainstorm, so you're coming up with ideas, the group is coming up with ideas. C is choose. Choose one of the ideas that you just brainstormed. So you're not choosing something else, you're choosing the ideas that you brainstormed. The D is the actual task of doing it. All right, so actually going through the motions and trying out one of those things ideas that we brainstormed and that we chose. And then E is the important one, is evaluating what worked and what didn't. And at which point then you could go up through the different levels and go back to brainstorming, you can go back to choosing, you could go back to asking more questions. Note, when we did it with the group, I framed it by saying, what are your questions? And then now you can begin. And no one asked any questions. So that's good for me as a facilitator. Note that, because then what I do to reflect is I'm going to ask the group 2 questions. One is, in that A, B, C, D, and E, which did you do the best as a group? Did you ask the best questions? Did you brainstorm the most? Did you really have a good discussion about choosing? Was the doing it the best, or was the evaluating the best? And then I'll also ask them the reverse question of, which could you improve upon? Which area do you need to work on more? And with the group that we worked with, I would probably say the question, you didn't even ask the question. So you just went and did it and tried to wing it, which was fine in that time scale. But if we were doing that with a group and the group decided to wing it, that would be a good discussion. Like in problem solving, you didn't really ask questions. And the last thing I'll say about that is the way that I asked the question, what are your questions? I think sometimes I hear people ask, does anyone have any questions? And I like the framing of what are your questions, because it gives license for them to be okay with having a question. I think sometimes people are hesitant to ask them because they don't want to be the one person who didn't get it, even though they didn't get it. So I always ask, what are your questions? Not, does anyone have any questions? Okay, so that framing at the start of the ABCs helps me reflect upon it at the end. And you can use that when you're reflecting on any kind of initiative. Now, the last question got asked in the Q&A was just about variations or other ideas, other initiatives. And I was thinking about an activity that I learned from Ryan McCormick, one of the High Five team, a few years back, probably 6-7 years ago. And it was this activity called Phonetically Speaking. So the way this works is you would think of a word that you want the group to say, and you'll break it up into, or a phrase, and then break it up into the phonetics of that word. So I'm going to take as an example the word lollipop. The only reason I'm thinking of it is because I literally just ate one. So, but think of any word you want to. It has possible meaning to you. I've often seen people using together everyone achieves more, which is like the breakdown of the word team, an acronym of the word team. Let's say I took lollipop, and what I would do in Zoom is I would privately chat. You can go into a chat and you can privately send someone a message, and you just give them the sounds you want them to use. So the start would be lolly. I would break it into law, like just law, and lee, and then the pop is I would make it a paw or a po, and then an op. Now each person is going to receive one of those. If I was doing it with a group of 4. If you do it with a larger group, you need to have as many of them for each of them. So 12, you need 12 of them. I'm imagining I had 4 people. And then the only thing that they can do is say that sound that you just gave them in the chat. They can't do anything else. And then they have to figure out the order in which they need to say it to get them to say lollipop. And they'll end up saying lollipop. And they'll keep doing it in a different order until they figured out the word they're trying to say is lollipop. Now, what you can do as well with the grid is you could actually have them send them a private chat, and they write it out on their own piece of paper, and at the end reveal that. And if you have sent it in the right order for the gallery view, then it will also say it across using the gallery view. And you would know this by seeing it on your screen. So another initiative for you to discuss or to play around with. This one is often very funny because it's just a lot of people saying random sounds. They'll have to figure out the order themselves, and you can be a part of that if you like. All right. I hope you got value out of this extended version of Zoom Mastermind that I led in the webinar. Feel free to reach out and ask more questions. High Five, we always are willing to share, and emails back and forth. You'll see an email from us with this video link. Feel free to send us an email. Thanks, everyone. Bye.